Alan Stone stood near the edge of the great hall, his hands folded behind his back, his posture calm and still. The hall was vast, shaped like a wide dome with tall crystal columns rising toward a ceiling that glowed with soft blue light. Delegates from many worlds filled the space. Some floated slightly above the floor, others stood on many kinds of legs, and a few sat in carefully designed chairs. Quiet conversations echoed like distant rain, mixing languages and tones that Alan could not always understand, but he listened all the same. Alan was a human envoy, chosen not for strength or rank but for patience. He had been told many times that humans were still considered strange by the wider galaxy. Too emotional, too soft, too slow to judge. Alan accepted this reputation without complaint. He believed listening mattered more than speaking, especially in places like this. At the center of the hall, a raised platform waited. When Baron Hale stepped onto it, the noise faded quickly. Hale was tall and thin, with pale skin that shimmered faintly under the light. His long robe flowed behind him, marked with symbols of status and power. His eyes moved across the crowd with open pride, as if everyone present existed only to observe him. A low sound of amusement came from the Baron's throat. He lifted one arm, and from behind him, two attendants guided a floating chair forward. Sitting in it was a young woman. Her name, Alan knew from the records, was Lyra Hale. Lyra's body was still except for her hands, which rested quietly in her lap. Her legs lay motionless, covered neatly by the fabric of her clothing. Her face showed no fear, only a distant calm, as though she had learned long ago to hide her feelings in public places. Her eyes were clear and alert, watching the room with careful attention. Baron Hale turned slightly toward her, then back to the crowd. His smile widened. "My peers," he said, his voice smooth and loud, "today I offer a moment of humor to remind us of the differences between our cultures." Some in the audience leaned forward. Others shifted uncomfortably. "This is my daughter Lyra," the Baron continued. "She was born incomplete." He waved a hand casually toward her legs. "She cannot walk. She cannot fight. She cannot serve any true purpose among my people." A quiet tension spread through the hall. Alan felt it like a pressure against his chest. Baron Hale laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the crystal walls. "Humans," he said, turning his gaze toward Alan, "are known for their compassion, their desire to protect the weak. So I ask you, Alan Stone, will you take her?" A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Some delegates watched with interest. Others looked away. A few waited eagerly, expecting refusal. Alan did not answer right away. He walked forward slowly, his footsteps soft against the smooth floor. As he approached the platform, he looked not at the Baron but at Lyra. Their eyes met briefly. In hers he did not see shame. He saw tired understanding. "She is useless to us," Baron Hale added, his tone mocking. "A burden. Consider her a gift. Or perhaps a joke." Silence filled the hall. Alan stopped a few steps from the platform. He took a breath, steady and controlled. Then he nodded. "I accept," he said. The words were simple, but their effect was not. A sharp wave of surprise passed through the audience. Murmurs rose, overlapping and confused. Baron Hale's smile faltered for just a moment. "You do?" he asked, clearly amused but also curious. "You would take responsibility for one who offers nothing?" Alan lifted his head. "I would take responsibility for a person," he replied calmly. The Baron studied him, then laughed again, louder than before. "Very well," he said. "She is yours." The attendants released control of the floating chair. For a brief second, it drifted uncertainly. Alan stepped forward and steadied it, placing a hand on the side. His touch was gentle, careful not to startle her. Lyra looked up at him. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly. "I know," Alan replied. "But I want to." He turned back to the Baron. "With your permission," he said, "I will take her now." Baron Hale waved a dismissive hand. "Take her. I have no further need." Alan nodded once more. Slowly he guided the chair away from the platform. As he did, he felt the weight of many eyes on his back. Some were curious, some confused, some quietly judging. As they moved toward the exit, Lyra spoke again. "Why?" she asked. "You gain nothing." Alan paused near the doorway. He thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he said, "the value of a choice is not what it gives you, but what it refuses to take away." Lyra did not reply, but her fingers tightened slightly in her lap. Behind them, the hall slowly filled with sound again. Conversations resumed, though many were now different in tone. Something had shifted, small but noticeable. Alan guided Lyra onto the transport platform outside the hall. The air was cooler there and the stars stretched endlessly above them. "You are safe," Alan said. "I promise." Lyra looked up at the sky, then back at him. For the first time, a hint of emotion crossed her face. Not hope, not joy, but something quieter. Possibility. The transport doors closed behind them, and the hall of laughter and judgment faded away, left behind with a joke that no longer felt amusing at all. The human ship moved through space with a quiet and steady rhythm, and inside its walls everything felt calm and balanced, which was something Lyra had never known before, because from the moment she entered the ship she noticed there were no sharp voices, no mocking looks, and no signs of discomfort from those who passed her, only soft footsteps, gentle lights, and a feeling of order that did not push or rush her in any way. Alan Stone made sure to walk beside her instead of ahead of her, keeping his pace matched to her movement, guiding her without pulling or directing her chair, which felt strange to Lyra because on her home world people always rushed when dealing with her, as if being near her for too long would stain their pride. And when Alan showed her the room prepared for her, she stayed silent for a long moment because the space was clearly designed with thought, with wide paths, reachable controls, a low bed, and a window that opened to a view of drifting stars, and she did not know how to respond to this kind of care, since no one had ever planned anything for her comfort before, and when Alan told her that she could change anything she wanted, she almost believed he was joking, but his face showed no humor, only honesty, and after he left her alone she waited, expecting someone to return and tell her the room was temporary or borrowed, yet time passed and nothing changed, which slowly settled into her mind as a quiet truth that this space truly belonged to her. And the next morning when Alan returned with a warm drink and sat with her near the window, he did not ask her about her condition or her limits but instead asked what she thought about traveling through space, and she hesitated before answering because she was used to questions that carried traps, but his tone carried no judgment, so she answered honestly, and he listened carefully without interrupting, which made her feel uneasy at first because being heard was unfamiliar, and as days passed Alan continued to visit her, sometimes with questions, sometimes with silence, and sometimes with simple stories about the ship or humanity, and he always asked her opinion on small things such as routes, patterns, or observations, and slowly Lyra realized that he was not pretending, because when she pointed out a flaw in a system or a pattern that felt unnatural, Alan tested her idea instead of dismissing it, and when it worked he thanked her as if her thoughts had real value, and this experience began to change how she carried herself, because she no longer felt the need to shrink or hide her words, and the crew noticed this change as well, greeting her by name and speaking to her naturally, not as a burden or a duty but as a part of the ship, and Lyra began to sleep more peacefully, waking without the tight fear she had lived with for years. And one evening while watching the stars drift past the window she asked Alan why he accepted her when her own people had not, and he answered simply that leaving her felt wrong, which confused her more than any cruel answer could have, because she was used to being measured by what she could not do rather than what she could think, and as time passed she learned more about how human systems worked, noticing that they were flexible, designed to adapt rather than force control, which felt deeply familiar to her own way of thinking. And when Alan told her that she thought in connections instead of rules, she felt something warm settle in her chest because no one had ever described her mind as useful before, and gradually she spoke more freely, even allowing herself to laugh once without fear, and no one mocked her for it, and later when Alan asked her to help choose a safer path through a difficult region of space, she studied the data carefully and chose the longer route to reduce future strain, and when Alan called her choice wise she realized that he never tried to fix her or change her, but instead made room for her to exist as she was, and for the first time in her life Lyra felt that her thoughts had weight and meaning, not because someone pitied her, but because someone respected her, and this quiet change reshaped how she saw herself, turning her from something discarded into someone present, and though nothing about her body had changed, everything about her place in the world had, and in that simple human ship, through ordinary conversations and gentle respect, Lyra began to understand that being valued was not something earned through strength, but something given through understanding, and that realization stayed with her, steady and strong, as the stars continued to move outside the window and the ship carried them both forward into something new. The human ship moved steadily through space, carrying its crew and its passengers through the calm and silent void, yet that silence was soon broken by the sudden appearance of a strange distortion that shimmered ahead in the distance, a ripple in the stars that made the instruments beep and shiver with uncertainty, and the crew became tense as the readings fluctuated and alarms quietly rang, not loudly but with persistent insistence, signaling something beyond the normal parameters, something the humans had not encountered before, and for the first time since their journey began, A shared unease settled over the cabin, making everyone glance at one another with small, questioning looks, wondering how they would navigate the unexpected. And Alan Stone remained calm as always, but he felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier because the lives of everyone aboard rested on the choices made in the next few moments, and he knew that any mistake could be disastrous, yet he also knew that panic would not solve the problem, and so he gathered the crew, explaining the situation with clear words and calm gestures. And when he finished speaking, he turned to Lyra Hale, who sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes tracking every movement, every change in the instruments, and he asked her, softly, "Would you like to see the data?" Lyra blinked, slightly surprised because no one had ever invited her to be part of a decision like this before, and she hesitated only for a moment before nodding, intrigued by the possibility of finally contributing in a meaningful way. And Alan guided her chair to the central console, showing her the streams of numbers, the lines of readings, the graphs and charts that filled the display, and he explained the basics without condescension, as if she had always belonged there, as if her mind mattered. And for the first time, Lyra felt that quiet warmth of recognition that she had never experienced, the sensation that someone truly valued her thoughts, her observations, her very presence. And she leaned forward, examining the readings with careful attention, noticing small irregularities in the patterns that the crew had overlooked, subtle shifts in the waves of data that hinted at the true shape of the anomaly, small vibrations in the distortion that suggested movement and direction, details so fine that most people would not see them, and yet she did because she had learned to observe deeply, to notice the hidden connections that others ignored. And she traced the lines with her finger, following each twist and turn, speaking softly as she began to describe what she saw, and the crew listened in surprise because her words were precise and insightful, revealing the structure of the anomaly in a way that even the trained eyes of the human crew had not perceived. And Alan nodded gently, encouraging her to continue, and as she spoke, she felt a confidence growing inside her, a quiet sense of purpose, a feeling that her mind had a place here, that her thoughts were not only valid but essential. And she suggested adjustments to the ship's path, showing where to steer and where to slow, explaining clearly why each movement mattered and how it would prevent the ship from being caught in the turbulence. And for the first time in her life, Lyra felt the exhilaration of being truly useful, of being needed, of seeing the immediate effect of her ideas as the crew implemented them, adjusting the thrusters according to her observations, recalibrating instruments based on her suggestions, and slowly, methodically, the ship moved through the distortion, the readings stabilizing as they passed through the anomaly safely, the alarms quieting, the tension melting away into relief, and the crew, though impressed with the human captain's calm and steady decisions, could not hide their astonishment at Lyra's unexpected insight, because she had seen what no one else had. She had understood what had been hidden in plain view, and she had guided them all safely through a situation that could have been disastrous. And when the ship cleared the last shimmer of distortion and the stars returned to their normal patterns, a quiet cheer ran through the control room, soft and careful, not loud or overwhelming, because humans rarely celebrated with noise. But the warmth of accomplishment was real and tangible, and Alan looked at Lyra with a small smile, not of surprise but of quiet pride, because he had always known her mind was capable, even when the rest of the galaxy ignored it. And Lyra felt a strange new sensation, a mixture of amazement, relief and joy, because for the first time her thoughts had mattered to everyone around her and they had saved lives, and she realized that the value she had long believed was missing from her existence had been there all along, hidden beneath assumptions and judgments, waiting for someone to see it, and now it was visible to all, shining quietly in her own confidence and in the respect of the crew. And as the minutes passed, she began to speak more freely, explaining not just the details she had noticed in the anomaly, but also her reasoning, how the patterns connected, how small shifts in data could reveal large consequences. And each word she spoke was met with attentive eyes, with nods of understanding, with silent acknowledgement that she was not just a passenger, but a critical mind in their journey. And even the younger crew members, who had initially glanced at her with polite curiosity, now watched her with genuine interest, asking questions about her logic, her thought process. And she responded with patience, sometimes hesitant but always thorough, and each answer she gave strengthened her confidence, because she realized that she was capable of influencing the world around her, that her mind could navigate complexities that others could not, that her ideas had power, even in this vast and endless expanse of stars. And Alan continued to guide her gently, offering explanations when needed but never overshadowing her. And for the first time, Lyra felt truly seen, fully present and entirely valuable, and she smiled quietly to herself, understanding that this moment, this feeling, was something she would carry for the rest of her life, a reminder That intelligence and insight were not measured by physical ability, but by clarity, observation and courage, and as the ship sailed forward, leaving the distortion behind, Lyra looked out the window at the stars and felt a quiet connection to everything around her, knowing that she had contributed, that she had mattered, that she had been trusted, and the warmth of that knowledge settled in her chest like a steady flame, gentle but persistent, giving her a sense of belonging she had never known before, and the rest of the crew, though modest in their expressions, could feel the change too, the subtle shift in the energy of the room, a respect for the young woman who had quietly solved what others had feared, and they began to speak to her with more attention, more inclusion, more patience, and she responded in kind, offering her thoughts not as a burden, but as a gift. And as hours passed, Alan encouraged her to review other readings, other data sets, other minor adjustments to the ship's course, and each time she contributed, she grew stronger in confidence, more precise in her thinking, more assured in the value of her observations, and she no longer hesitated to ask questions herself, to challenge minor assumptions, to propose alternatives, and the human crew responded with consideration rather than dismissal, showing her that ideas mattered more than appearances, that contribution mattered more than convention, that insight mattered more than expectation, and in that long, quiet stretch of space, Lyra learned something that would stay with her forever, that her mind had always been capable, that her worth had never been tied to physical ability, and that sometimes, being truly valuable meant simply being seen and trusted. And as the stars stretched endlessly beyond the ship's window, shimmering in the darkness, she realized she had found a place where she belonged, not because she could walk or fight, but because she could understand, because she could see, because she could guide, and the ship moved onward, steady and calm, carrying everyone safely, guided by human ingenuity and the hidden talent of a young woman who had long been underestimated, and for the first time, Lyra felt the deep, quiet joy of knowing that her mind could change outcomes, save lives and earn genuine respect, and the warmth of that realization spread through her in a way no physical accomplishment ever could, and she understood finally that the galaxy had overlooked her for too long, that her abilities had always been there, quiet, patient, waiting to be noticed, and now they had been, and she could feel the beginnings of a new life, not as a burden or a joke, but as someone essential, someone capable, someone valued. And Alan watched her with quiet pride, knowing she had just experienced something no one could take away from her, and as the ship sailed into the calm, open space beyond the distortion, the stars reflected in Lyra's eyes like tiny sparks of promise, and she realized fully for the first time that she was, in truth, a person of worth, intelligence and talent, and that knowledge would guide her always, shaping her future with hope, confidence, and the quiet certainty that she mattered. News of Lyra's contributions traveled faster than anyone expected, reaching the halls of the Galactic Council and stirring conversations among delegates from multiple worlds, who had long been used to the typical hierarchies of alien nobility, where physical ability and traditional power often outweighed intelligence. And yet here was a young woman, previously dismissed and overlooked, whose insight had not only guided a human vessel safely through a dangerous distortion in space but had also demonstrated an unexpected depth of reasoning, clarity, and problem-solving ability that left even experienced navigators impressed. And when the reports reached Baron Hale, his pale face tightened with unease, a feeling unfamiliar to him, because he had always believed that his daughter's inability to walk rendered her weak, limited, and inconsequential in the grand structure of their society, and now he was faced with evidence that contradicted every assumption he had ever made, every lesson he had taught himself about usefulness, and every judgment he had carried regarding ability and value. And the council itself, upon hearing the news, immediately summoned the Baron, sending formal messages that could not be ignored, and he complied, moving through the polished halls of his own palace with a sense of unease that he did not usually feel, because though he had power, he had never before been faced with an idea or achievement of someone he had deemed worthless. And when he entered the council chamber, he saw the room filled with humans, aliens of various species, and council members seated in careful order, and at the center of the discussion were diagrams, data streams, and records of the human ship's passage through the anomaly, all credited in part to the observations of Lyra Hale. And as he looked on, he noticed how the delegates listened attentively to her suggestions and insights, how they spoke with respect, asking questions, nodding at her reasoning, and he felt a sinking feeling in his chest, the slow realization that what he had once dismissed as a joke, a burden, or an irrelevance had in fact proven vital, essential, and respected by many, and he could feel the warmth of pride that might have been his in a different circumstance, but it was not his, because this achievement belonged to Lyra, and he had ignored her for so long, had never once asked her opinion, had never trusted her judgment, had never given her a chance to speak, and now the entire council watched her with admiration while he remained on the outside of that recognition, a spectator to what he had failed to nurture, and the human captain, Alan Stone, who had worked quietly alongside her, addressed the council and the Baron in a calm, deliberate voice, saying simply and clearly, "She was never broken. She was ignored," and the weight of those words carried across the chamber, settling into the silence that followed, because there was no argument against them, no rebuttal that could erase the truth of the statement, and Baron Hale's eyes narrowed slightly as he considered how long he had judged incorrectly, how many opportunities he had denied her, how often he had relied on superficial standards rather than seeing the mind and heart beneath, and for the first time he felt the sting of humility, the sharp awareness that his actions, or lack of them, had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. And as he watched Lyra respond to questions calmly, intelligently, and with authority, explaining her logic, guiding others through the same reasoning that had saved the ship, he could feel a growing respect that mingled uneasily with guilt, a mix of admiration for her courage and skill and regret for the way he had once dismissed her entirely, and the council members murmured their approval, sharing quiet words of encouragement with Lyra, acknowledging that her contribution had not only saved a ship and its crew but had also set a precedent, showing that intelligence, insight, and the ability to solve complex problems were worth far more than rigid measures of physical strength or outward appearance, and every gesture, every nod, every thoughtful pause in her explanations reinforced the realization that she had been capable all along, and the Baron, sitting stiffly in his seat, could not escape the truth no matter how much he tried to rationalize his past behavior, because the evidence was right there in front of him, clear and undeniable, and he saw how the humans treated her, how they deferred to her suggestions, how they incorporated her ideas into their plans without hesitation, and he understood that the respect she had earned was genuine, earned through merit, not through title, not through inheritance, and that this respect had changed the dynamics in the room entirely, demonstrating a value system that he had never fully appreciated, and he felt a quiet, gnawing discomfort as he realized that his assumptions, his jokes, his lack of attention, and his decisions had all been misguided, that he had ignored potential where it mattered most, and now that potential had revealed itself despite him, and it shone brightly, not diminished by past neglect, but only more pronounced, stronger because of what had been overcome, and Alan Stone, standing calmly nearby, watched the Baron closely, understanding without speaking that the Baron's silence was full of realization, and when Alan's eyes met Lyra's she felt a quiet affirmation, a confirmation that her work, her insight, and her voice mattered, and that for the first time she was recognized not only by humans but by those who had previously counted her as nothing, and the Baron felt a tension in his chest, a mix of pride and shame, because he was proud of her accomplishments yet ashamed that he had never facilitated them, had never given her space, had never offered encouragement, and the council continued to listen to her explanations, asking questions that required careful thought, and she answered clearly, thoughtfully, and patiently, never faltering, never appearing uncertain, and the Baron could not help but be impressed by her calm composure, her careful logic, her ability to communicate effectively across species and cultures, and he understood fully that his earlier assessments of her worth had been entirely wrong, that she had always possessed intelligence, clarity, insight, and resilience that could match or surpass the expectations of anyone, and that realization pressed upon him with quiet force, a reminder of how deeply he had erred, how carelessly he had judged, and how little he had understood, and the chamber remained quiet for long moments after Alan spoke, the silence amplifying the truth in his words. She was never broken. She was ignored, and Baron Hale, though still tall and dignified, felt himself smaller in that quiet, weighty moment, because there was no reply, no excuse, no words to counter the undeniable evidence, only the realization of what he had failed to see, and he watched Lyra, who continued to guide discussions, point out patterns and offer insight with clarity and precision, and each time she spoke, the Baron felt a renewed awareness of the gap between his assumptions and reality, and the room around him seemed different, filled with people who now regarded Lyra as equal, as capable, as essential, and he recognized that he had allowed prejudice and habit to blind him to her true abilities, that he had assumed weakness where there had been strength, and that all those years of neglect had created a distance he could not easily repair, yet he also felt a spark of hope, because the recognition she now received was genuine, deserved, and transformative, and he understood that her success was not just a personal achievement but a statement, a demonstration to all that true worth is not measured in conventional ways, and in that council chamber, as discussions continued and her voice guided decisions, he could feel the profound weight of his own error, the long shadow of missed opportunities, and yet he also felt admiration, deep and quiet, for the young woman who had shown courage, intelligence, patience, and brilliance under circumstances that would have intimidated most, and the realization settled in him fully, that while he had judged incorrectly for years, the world now saw her as he had failed to see her, and that knowledge pressed upon him in quiet waves, leaving him thoughtful, silent, and aware of the mistake he could not undo, and the room itself seemed to honor her presence, filled with attentive eyes, careful questions and measured words, all acknowledging the unique ability she possessed. And Baron Hale, finally, had nothing left to offer but his silent recognition, an unspoken acceptance that he had erred, that she had been underestimated, that intelligence and insight had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And as the council continued their discussions, Alan Stone and Lyra exchanged brief, subtle smiles, understanding that the moment was complete, that the lesson had been made clear, and that the Baron had been faced with the undeniable truth of what ignoring potential could cost. And in that quiet, reflective space, Baron Hale finally understood, fully, painfully, but also with a small sense of wonder, that Lyra had never been broken, only overlooked, and now she stood as proof of what could happen when perception and judgment were challenged by reality, and for the first time, he felt regret so deep it was nearly tangible, a quiet, consuming understanding of how he had misjudged the very person he should have cherished, and he could only remain still, letting silence remind him of every mistake, every dismissal, and every moment he had failed to value her, and that quiet reminder was perhaps the hardest lesson he had ever faced, more difficult than any command, any battle, or any loss he had endured, because it touched the very core of how he had assessed life, value, and worth, and it was a lesson he would never forget. Lyra Hale, after weeks of observation, learning, and participating alongside the humans, made a decision that would shape the rest of her life and influence the wider galaxy, because she understood fully now that her abilities, her insight, and her mind were valued and respected in ways she had never experienced before, and she also recognized that she had the choice to continue her life in a space where her presence made a tangible difference rather than returning to a world that had once dismissed her entirely and treated her as less than capable. And when she spoke with Alan Stone privately in the quiet observation room of the ship, she said clearly and calmly that she wished to remain with the humans, to continue contributing as an advisor and thinker, not out of obligation or pity, but out of the recognition that here her skills had purpose, that her mind could guide, that her ideas mattered, and Alan, who had long understood her potential and quietly facilitated her growth, nodded gently and smiled, assuring her that her choice would be respected and that she would be given opportunities to shape not only the ship's path but also the systems, strategies, and decisions that the humans made in their voyages across the stars. And Lyra felt a calm warmth settle in her chest, a quiet sense of belonging she had never experienced before, because for the first time she was truly free to contribute, to think, to act, and to be recognized without judgment. And as days turned into weeks, she began to take on tasks that had previously been reserved for senior officers, offering insights into navigation, strategy, and interspecies communication, each time demonstrating the depth of her reasoning and the clarity of her mind. And her contributions did not go unnoticed, as reports of her work began to reach not only human command but also the wider council of interstellar delegates who observed the progress of diplomacy, travel, and exploration. And slowly, small discussions began about how to redefine value and strength across worlds, inspired by the demonstration that a person once dismissed as weak could in fact offer insight that surpassed expectations. And as these discussions unfolded, Lyra found herself at the center of a quiet revolution in thought, one that challenged centuries of assumptions about ability, weakness, and utility, and she realized that her choice to stay with the humans was not only a personal decision but also a catalyst for wider change, because it showed that seeing worth where others refused to see it could create new opportunities for inclusion, cooperation, and growth. And across the council chambers, delegates who had once measured potential by strength, agility, or inherited position now began to consider intelligence, insight, and creativity as equally important, and small policies and recommendations were drafted, slowly forming the foundation of laws that would define a new understanding of weakness, inclusion, and ability. And the influence of her presence extended beyond the ship into diplomatic circles, interstellar negotiations, and policy discussions, because the evidence of her contribution was undeniable, tangible, and replicable, demonstrating clearly that traditional measures of value were incomplete, and that new measures, those that accounted for mind, observation, and reasoning, were not only fairer but also more effective. And as the discussions continued, Lyra worked closely with Alan, guiding the implementation of changes, offering advice to teams on how to identify talent previously overlooked, helping them to see the unique abilities of individuals whose worth had been ignored, and she did this not with pride or arrogance, but with calm patience, teaching by example, speaking with clarity, and allowing others to understand that intelligence and contribution could take many forms. And as she moved through these new responsibilities, she began to notice the changes occurring in the way humans and aliens treated one another. As cooperation improved, trust deepened, and assumptions were challenged, because leaders now questioned traditional hierarchies and re-evaluated those they had once dismissed, seeking instead to discover hidden strengths, untapped potential, and insights that had previously been invisible due to bias or habit. And the ripple effect of this change spread slowly but steadily, reaching smaller ships, colonies, and research teams, where the stories of Lyra's contributions were shared quietly but consistently, inspiring those who had long believed themselves to be limited by circumstance, environment, or physical challenges to realize that their minds, their observations, and their decisions mattered. And Lyra herself watched these developments with calm satisfaction, understanding that her choice to remain with the humans had allowed not only her own abilities to flourish but had also created a precedent that would impact countless lives across many species, across many worlds, and across many systems. And as she continued to offer advice and guidance, she developed systems for training others to observe, reason, and contribute, helping people discover ways to be useful even when previously overlooked. And the human crew adapted readily, trusting her judgment, following her recommendations, and seeing the benefit of including insights from minds that might have been underestimated. And in quiet moments, when the ship moved smoothly through the endless stars, Lyra reflected on the contrast between her life before and now, remembering the cold, dismissive halls of her father's palace, the judgment she had endured, the isolation she had felt, and she realized that while her past had shaped her resilience, it had not defined her potential, because potential is not measured by circumstance or expectation, but by opportunity, encouragement, and recognition. And she was grateful to Alan, who had treated her as a mind capable of contribution, who had given her responsibility, trust, and the freedom to act, because his faith had allowed her to discover her hidden talent. And as she looked out the window at the stars stretching endlessly before them, she understood that humanity's strength lay not in force or power, not in physical dominance or control, but in the ability to see worth where others refused to see it, in the ability to recognize potential that others overlooked, in the simple, quiet respect for insight, observation, and intelligence. And she felt a sense of purpose settle deeply into her being, a calm knowledge that she would continue to serve as an advisor and thinker, not for praise or glory, but because her mind had value and her contribution mattered, and the ripple effect of her presence and guidance would continue to shape decisions, policies, and perceptions across species and systems, because she had proven by example that true strength is measured not in appearances, inheritance, or tradition, but in the courage to contribute, the clarity to observe, and the wisdom to act. And as time passed, new laws began to form across multiple worlds, changing definitions of weakness, inclusion, and value, offering opportunities for those previously overlooked, and creating a culture where observation, insight, and intellect were honored alongside physical ability and traditional achievement. And Lyra, moving among these discussions, these committees, these advisory meetings, continued to teach, to guide, to influence, and to show quietly but powerfully that the galaxy could be more just, more thoughtful, and more effective when it recognized the worth of minds long ignored. And Alan Stone, standing quietly beside her during these changes, never claimed victory, because victory was not a word he used to describe the growth and insight of others, and he understood fully that his role was to facilitate, to observe, to support, and to allow potential to emerge. And together they worked not for personal recognition but for the future, for the acknowledgement that humanity's quiet power was in its ability to see and honor value where others refused, to provide space for insight to flourish, and to prove that respect and understanding could create change far more profound than fear, force, or dominance. And as the ship sailed through stars that stretched like silver rivers across the void, Lyra felt a sense of calm certainty that she had finally found her place, a place where her ideas mattered, her voice was heard, and her contribution was respected, a place where humanity's quiet strength illuminated the path forward, showing that seeing worth where others refused was not just a lesson, but a force capable of shaping worlds, systems, and lives. And she smiled softly, not with pride, but with understanding, because she knew that her choice to remain had changed not only her life, but the way countless others would be seen, valued, and understood. And that realization settled over her, like the gentle warmth of the stars themselves, steady, lasting, and unwavering.